Hello everyone, and thank you for choosing to spend your evening here with me. If you enjoy these stories, I'd truly appreciate your subscription, like, and comment. It only takes a second for you, but it means the world to me and helps make each video even better. Now, get comfortable and let's begin. Here is what no one tells you. What you do every night, closing your eyes for 8 hours straight, believing it is natural, that humans have always slept this way, and that your body specifically demands this exact rhythm. For the most part, this is a lie, not a biological truth. It is a story written by factory whistles, alarm clocks, and the economic needs of industrial nations that required workers to wake up at the same time every morning. An 8 hours sleep is not ancient wisdom encoded in your DNA. This rule is about 150 years old. It is younger than the light bulb, younger than the telephone, and for most of human history, such a way of sleeping would have seemed strange and even dangerous. This script will take you through 3 threads that weave into something almost no one talks about. First, there is the lost architecture of sleep, a completely different way our ancestors spent their nights for hundreds of thousands of years. A pattern so normal that medieval doctors recommended it, so universal that languages had specific words for it, so natural that when you wake up at 2 a.m. and cannot fall back asleep, you are not broken. You are experiencing an echo of how people slept before modernity tried to fix us. Second, there came a moment when sleep became truly dangerous in a new sense. Not because of predators lurking outside your cave. That is an old danger we will return to. The danger is that we have built a world that punishes sleep. A 24-hour society where exhausted tanker captains run ships onto reefs, where surgeons operate for 28 hours straight, where nuclear plant operators fall asleep at the control panels. The price of this is measured in oil spills, plane crashes, and death tolls. And third, scientific data that has been quietly accumulating for decades suggests that 8 hours might not even be the right number. Mortality data, the real statistical link between how much you sleep and how long you live, tells a more complex story than the one you were sold. But first, let me paint a picture for you, because that is what makes it real. It is the year 1350. You are lying in a house somewhere in England, France, or Germany. There is obviously no electricity, and no streetlights either. The darkness outside is not the diluted darkness of modern suburbs, where light pollution tints the sky orange. It is a total, deep, almost physical darkness, the kind that presses against your windows. You went to bed about 3 hours after sunset, as soon as your body felt heavy and the work was finished. Now you are awake, completely awake. It is past midnight. You cannot check exactly because clocks that could tell the hour do not yet exist in most homes. But you feel no anxiety. You do not reach for pills or scroll through a phone, wondering what is wrong with you. This marks the end of the first sleep. This awakening is expected, normal, planned. Perhaps you get up and check the fire, adding wood if it is cold. Perhaps you pray, because religious texts of that era specifically mention prayers suitable for this hour. Perhaps you speak quietly with your spouse, or perhaps you just lie there and think, letting your thoughts drift through problems and memories in a way the busy daylight hours never allow. Historical records mention this time as uniquely suited for reflection, for intimacy, for deep thoughts that require silence and gloom. Then, an hour or two later, you feel sleep returning. You slip into what the same historical sources called second sleep, and you remain in it until dawn, until work, children, or animals demand your attention. This was not insomnia. This was life for most of human existence. If you are listening to this right now, I am curious. Where are you and what time is it? Write in the comments, because I read them, and it is fascinating. Berlin at breakfast, Boston before bed, Bangkok in the afternoon. Everyone is listening to the same story about sleep. It seems we are all trying to understand what we have lost. The myth of 8 hours sleep replaced this pattern, not because science proved it was better. It replaced it because factories needed shift workers who would show up exactly at 6 a.m. Because schools needed children sitting in rows at 8 o'clock. because an industrializing world needed synchronized schedules more than human biology. And in this transformation, something nearly killed us. It didn't kill us as a species, like that bottleneck 900,000 years ago, but it killed us in specific, preventable, deeply tragic ways, the cost of which we are still calculating. March 24, 1989, just after midnight, the Exxon Valdez, a supertanker over 3 football fields long, loaded with 53 million gallons of crude oil, strikes Bligh Reef in Prince William Sound, Alaska. The third mate at the helm had been awake for 18 hours. The captain was asleep, possibly drunk. Later, investigators would state that fatigue was a direct contributing factor. 10.8 million gallons of oil spilled into some of the most pristine waters on Earth. More than 1,300 miles of coastline poisoned. Hundreds of thousands of dead seabirds. An entire ecosystem devastated because someone was too tired to steer straight. This is not ancient history. This is the price of pretending that humans can work on schedules that ignore what we actually need. And this is just one example. We will return to this. To the meltdown at Chernobyl at 1:23 a.m. To medical errors in the pre-dawn hours. To all those cases where our war against sleep struck back. But first, we need to go back. Far back. Before the lie of 8 hours. Before clocks and factories. Even before houses and fire, we need to understand how people actually slept. When survival was the only important schedule. Here is what you need to know about the question, how did people sleep for 300,000 years? The answer is not like you. Throughout the vast period of our species' existence, there were no clocks, no alarm bells, no shift schedules, no school start times, no meetings exactly at 9 o'clock. There was sunrise, sunset, the phases of the moon, and the rhythm of the seasons. That was it. And within this framework, sleep was strikingly flexible, strikingly variable. Nothing like the rigid 8-hour block we have convinced ourselves is a law of nature. The best window into this lost world is provided by people still living without electricity. Researchers have spent years studying modern hunter-gatherer groups, the Hadza in Tanzania, the San in Namibia, the Simane in Bolivia, attaching actigraphy monitors to their wrists to track real sleep patterns in conditions close to how our ancestors lived. And what they found surprised everyone. These people, living without artificial light, without smartphones or Netflix, without all the things we blame for our sleep problems, sleep an average of about 6.5 hours a day. Not 10, not 12. Some nights it's 5.7 hours, others 7.1, averaging around 6.4. They fall asleep about 3 hours after sunset, not as soon as darkness falls. They wake up about an hour before sunrise, and their sleep changes depending on the season. Longer in winter, shorter in summer, and not just because of the length of daylight, but because of temperature. Temperature. Here is the variable no one talks about. These groups tend to fall asleep when the air begins to cool after sunset and wake up when it reaches its coldest point right before dawn. The environment doesn't just set their schedule, it regulates it directly through thermal signals that modern climate-controlled bedrooms have completely erased. But here is where it gets interesting. These patterns are not uniform or rigid. Some groups demonstrate consolidated night sleep plus a short nap during the brutal midday heat. Others show something close to the segmented pattern we just talked about. A main sleep period, a brief awakening around midnight, then a second sleep until dawn. Among the Hadza, in particular, someone is often awake at different times throughout the night, which makes sense. If everyone is unconscious at the same time, who watches for predators, who maintains the fire, who listens for danger? This variability is not a bug, it is a feature. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived in small groups, perhaps 20 to 50 people, moving after game and seasons, sleeping in temporary shelters or under the open sky, always being vulnerable. In such conditions, a sleep pattern where part of the group remains in a state of light alertness at staggered intervals had enormous survival value. Anthropologists studying traditional societies find this pattern again and again. A system of rotational watch based not on formal duties, but on the natural variability of when different people feel sleepy. And when you compare modern humans to our primate relatives, something else becomes clear. We sleep less than they do, but better. Chimpanzees sleep from 10 to 17 hours, depending on species and age. Gorillas can clock 12-14 hours. Most primates sleep away more than half of their lives. Humans spend about 78 hours, often less. Nevertheless, we spend a much higher percentage of that time in the REM phase, rapid eye movement. In deep, slow-wave sleep, those restorative stages that truly matter. The main theory for why this is so comes down to real estate. Our ancestors moved from sleeping in trees to sleeping on the ground. This is a huge shift in terms of vulnerability. In a tree, you are relatively safe, fits and comfortable, but protected. You can afford to sleep long and lightly, dozing for extended periods without deep immersion into an unconscious state. On the ground, however, especially when you have fire and a social group around you, you are better protected from predators but more exposed to everything else. The cold, the risk of the fire going out and you suddenly becoming prey again. In these conditions, natural selection favored efficiency. To sleep less, but deeper. To get the necessary neurological restoration in few hours, so as not to lie unconscious and unprotected longer than necessary. Quality over quantity, depth over duration. This is the evolutionary trade-off that shapes the architecture of human sleep. And it is exactly why we are able to function on 7 hours while other primates would be shattered. But everything becomes more complicated when you look at cultures that preserved more traditional patterns into the modern era. Mediterranean siestas, Latin American midday rest, similar practices in the Middle East, South, and East Asia. These are not lazy cultural quirks. They are adaptations. In hot climates, working in the height of the midday heat is inefficient and dangerous. Therefore, you compress your night's sleep a bit, wake up early while it's cool, work, and then take a break for an hour or 90 minutes sleep during the hottest part of the day. Biphasic sleep, to separate periods that total roughly the same as monophasic sleep, but are distributed to match both human biology and environmental reality. Even in groups with electricity, researchers find that access to artificial light shifts bedtime about an hour later and reduces total sleep by 4,060 minutes compared to neighboring groups, still living by the light of fire and the moon. This tells us something extremely important. For most of human history, darkness limited the time you could sleep, but it did not standardize it. Fire extended the evening somewhat, allowing for socialization after sunset, but it was not bright or cheap enough to truly conquer the night. Sleep time was flexible within natural limits, responding to temperature, season, workload, and social dynamics. There was no right way to sleep, no pathological deviations. If you woke up at night, it wasn't insomnia requiring treatment. If you napped at noon, it wasn't laziness requiring correction. If you slept longer in winter and shorter in summer, it wasn't a disorder. It was simply human existence in an environment that shaped you as much as you shaped it. The 8-hour consolidated block that we consider normal, natural, the standard by which all deviations are measured, but is the anomaly. It is a strange modern experiment that we have been conducting for 5 or 6 generations. Before that, for 3,000 centuries, humans slept in patterns as diverse as their habitats and as flexible as the survival challenges they faced. And then everything changed. The evidence lies in dusty archives across Europe. Diaries, court records, medical treatises, prayer books, and literature spanning 3 centuries. And buried in these documents, appearing again and again in languages from English to French, Italian, and Latin, are 2 phrases that modern readers constantly stumble over. First sleep and second sleep. Not metaphors, not poetic expressions. Commonplace mentions of something everyone simply understood. The night had an architecture, and we have completely forgotten what it looked like. Historian Roger Eckert spent 16 years searching for these references, eventually gathering more than 500 documentary evidences of segmented sleep in the period, from roughly 1500 to 1800. From his research, a picture of pre-industrial European nights emerges that looks nothing like ours. People did not get into bed and sleep straight through until morning. They went to bed a couple of hours after sunset, slept for 3 or 4 hours, woke up, and stayed awake for 13 hours in the middle of the night. Then they went back to bed for another 3 or 4 hours until dawn. This was not insomnia. This was not a sleep disorder. It was simply how the night worked. The interval between the first and second sleep had a name, the watch, and people used it for whatever they pleased. Quiet household chores that fit into the liminal space between deep oblivion and the demands of daylight. You woke up naturally, not startled or anxious, but floating smoothly into the darkness. Perhaps your partner was already awake. Perhaps you were alone with yourself for a while. The most common activity was tending the fire. In winter, a fire left unattended for 8 hours would die out, and starting it from scratch in the middle of the night was back-breaking labor. So you woke up, added fuel, and made sure the embers stayed alive until morning. Practical, necessary, built into the rhythm of survival. But people did much more than just keep the fire going. Prayer books of the period included special prayers intended for the watch. Night vigils were built on the assumption that you would be awake, and in contemplation somewhere around midnight. Some texts explicitly instructed the faithful to use the time between sleeps for spiritual reflection, viewing it as a natural opportunity for communion with God when the world is quiet and the mind is clear, but not yet dulled by exhaustion. Sex. Medical texts of the era explicitly recommended it. After the first sleep, they said that is when conception is most likely, when the body has rested but has not yet become sluggish, when desire is strongest. Some doctors wrote detailed advice on how to time intercourse to the interval between sleeps, considering it a well-known fact that this was the time when couples would be most fertile and most satisfied. The watch was not merely tolerated. This sleep was medicalized. It was woven into expert recommendations on health and reproduction. People interpreted their dreams. The transition between the first and second sleep was often accompanied by vivid, memorable dreams, and waking immediately after one meant the images were still fresh. Dream interpretation manuals of the period assumed you would have time to lie in the dark, pondering what you had just experienced, deconstructing the symbolism, searching for meaning or warning. This was not marginal mysticism. It was common domestic practice. Some got up and walked around the house, visited neighbors, smoked, or did small tasks that did not require daylight. Court records mention crimes committed during the watch, petty thefts, and acts of vandalism committed by people who knew a portion of the population would be awake but not fully vigilant. This quiet hour provided cover for mischief. The fact that crime was specifically tied to the time of the watch tells us that this phenomenon was predictable and regular enough for people to plan their actions around it. And in all these sources, such behavior is described as perfectly normal. There is no wringing of hands in despair over interrupted sleep, no anxiety over being awake. The watch simply exists as part of the structure of the night, alongside sunset and sunrise. A 16th century physician writes matter-of-factly about patients waking after their first sleep, as if it requires no explanation. A 17th century diarist notes, he lay awake between sleeps, mulling over a problem at work. In an 18th century novel, characters meet for conversation in the hour between sleeps. Commonplace, unremarkable, the fabric of daily life. Now, a word about the long winter nights in Northern Europe. Darkness could last 14, 15, 16 hours. To go to bed shortly after sunset and try to sleep without interruption until dawn would mean 10 or 12 hours of continuous unconsciousness. That does not restore strength. It is excessive, impractical, and probably impossible for most people. Your body does not want to be inert for that long. You would wake up stiff, sluggish, with an urge to urinate, Experiencing discomfort. Segmented sleep elegantly solved this problem. You retired early because there was not much to do in the dark. After sleeping through the first block, you naturally woke for an hour or two of quiet activity, and then returned to bed for a second, shorter sleep that led you to dawn. Total sleep time might be the same 7 or 8 hours, but it was distributed in a way that matched both the constraints of the season and the limits of human physiology. You were not fighting your body's signals, you were working with them, and this pattern can be traced across all classes. Eckhart finds mentions of this among nobles and peasants, urban merchants and rural laborers. The wealthy might spend their watch reading by candlelight or having intimate conversations. The poor might use that time to check the livestock or mend clothes by the light of the hearth. Activities varied depending on resources, but the underlying rhythm seems to have been widespread, at least among the literate Europeans whose records survived. This is an important caveat. Much of what we know comes from people who could write or could afford to document their lives. Diaries, medical texts, court records, they all gravitate toward the educated and propertied classes. We have hints of similar patterns elsewhere. The Tiv people in Nigeria use terms translated as first sleep and second sleep as nighttime markers, but whether this custom was truly universal or concentrated in specific regions and social contexts remains a matter of debate. Some historians dispute Eckart's claims of ubiquity, arguing that the evidence is more sparse and variable than the narrative suggests. But here is what makes the theory of segmented sleep compelling beyond documentary evidence. In the 1990s, psychiatrist Thomas Ware conducted an experiment. He took modern subjects and placed them in conditions mimicking pre-industrial winter nights. 14 hours of darkness per day. No artificial light, no clocks, no external time cues, just darkness from early evening to late morning, like London in February around 1650. For the first few weeks, the subjects slept in long consolidated blocks, making up for modern sleep debt. But after a month, something changed. They began to sleep into distinct periods. 4 hours of sleep, then a natural awakening for 13 hours of quiet wakefulness, and then another 34 hours of sleep, spontaneously, without any instructions. Their bodies freed from electric light and social schedules plunged into the very pattern that Eckhart had found in documents from centuries ago. During the interval of wakefulness, the subjects reported a kind of meditative calm, a state of consciousness they described as peaceful and contemplative. They did not experience anxiety, did not try to force themselves back to sleep, but simply lay quietly, thinking and experiencing what one participant called an altered state somewhere between wakefulness and sleep. It was, they said, unlike anything in their usual modern lives. This leads to profound reflections. Segmented sleep may not be a cultural quirk or a reaction to specific historical conditions. It may be a natural human pattern, one that manifests when we remove ecological constraints, electric lights, alarm clocks, and work schedules that force us to sleep without interruption. The architecture of the night that Eckhart found in the archives may simply be what human sleep looks like when we allow it to develop, according to its own internal logic rather than external demands. But by the time Ware conducted his experiment, segmented sleep had already vanished from living experience. The watch had become insomnia. The interval between sleeps had become a pathology requiring treatment, and this transformation occurred so completely that when Eckhart first published his findings, most readers assumed he had discovered some strange historical anomaly, rather than a lost human universal. What happened? How did we manage to so thoroughly forget the architecture of the night that waking at midnight turned into a medical problem instead of a natural rhythm? The answer lies in candles, gas lamps, coffee houses, and the systematic conquest of darkness by artificial light. But it begins earlier than you think, and the consequences were darker than anyone imagined. However, there is something critically important that we need to understand about this interval between sleeps, about why humans developed such a pattern in the first place. It wasn't just about matching sleep to the duration of winter nights, or finding time for prayer. and intimacy. There was a darker, more primal reason. Sleep. Real, deep sleep. The kind of sleep where you are completely unconscious and vulnerable was dangerous, potentially lethal, and your ancestors knew it. Imagine a medieval English village. Timber frame houses pressed tightly together, thatched roofs overhead, walls of wattle and daub that burn like tinder. Inside each house is an open hearth on a dirt or wooden floor. There is no chimney, only a hole in the roof for smoke to escape. Rushes or dried herbs are scattered across the floor for insulation and scent. Woolen blankets, linen clothes, everything is highly flammable. And in the center of it all is a fire that must burn all night. Because winter in Northern Europe will kill you just as surely as any predator. Now imagine everyone in the house falling into a deep, uninterrupted sleep for 8 hours straight. A log rolls over, a spark flies out, lands in the rushes or catches the edge of a blanket, smolders for minutes, maybe an hour, and then erupts. By the time someone wakes up, the flames are already climbing the walls, and there is no way out. Everyone perishes. The fire spreads to neighboring houses. Half the village burns down before dawn. This was not a theory. It was a nightmare that shaped medieval life. In many years, fire killed more people in pre-modern Europe than the plague. And most of these fires started at night while families slept. The danger was so omnipresent, so catastrophic, that it became embedded in laws and language. The word curfew comes from the old French couvre-feu, literally cover fire. That is what it originally meant, not a restriction on movement, though it later became one. It meant the evening bell that told every household to cover their hearths with ash, so the embers would smolder safely all night without throwing sparks while everyone slept. Starting in the 14th century, and in some places likely earlier, English towns rang curfew bells at sunset. You heard their echo over the streets at 8 or 9 p.m. and knew what to do. Cover your fire. Make it safe, because unconsciousness is coming, and unconsciousness means vulnerability. But people also knew that if you covered the fire, it might go out before morning, and lighting a fire from scratch in the middle of a freezing night was an agonizing, and sometimes impossible, task. Therefore, the optimal strategy was not to extinguish the hearth completely and hope for the best. You needed to wake up, tend to it, add fuel, make sure it stayed alive but under control, and then go back to sleep knowing you had checked everything and the house wouldn't burn down. In the next few hours, the watch was not just a natural rhythm, it was a survival strategy. This interval between the first and second sleep, when you naturally woke up around midnight or 1 a.m., was your chance to make sure the fire hadn't killed you yet. You checked the hearth, listened for suspicious sounds, and verified that everything was in order. Only then did you allow yourself to slide into deep sleep for the second cycle. And it wasn't just about fire. Medieval and early modern cities organized complex systems of night watches precisely because they understood a sleeping population is a vulnerable population. Guards patrolled the streets from roughly 910 p.m. until dawn with lanterns, challenging anyone they met on the street after curfew. They looked for thieves, of course, but they also watched for fires, looking for the first glow of flames, listening for cries, ready to raise the alarm before a spark turned into an inferno. Court records from that period show that criminals timed their actions to watch the interval between sleeps. They knew that around midnight, part of the population would be awake but not fully vigilant, lying in the dark before sinking into the second sleep. This was a window of opportunity. People were conscious enough to hear a sound and ignore it as common night noise, but not vigilant enough to react quickly or organize resistance. Ideal conditions for theft, vandalism, or assault. The fact that crimes were strategically timed to the watch tells us how predictable this pattern was. You cannot plan actions and something random. Segmented sleep was regular and widespread enough for criminals to build tactics around it, and night watchers learned to patrol particularly carefully during these hours, knowing the population was most vulnerable. But the truly interesting evidence comes from a completely different place. Tanzania. The Hadza people, one of the last remaining groups of hunter-gatherers, living in conditions that may be close to how humans spent most of their evolutionary history. Researchers studying Hadza sleep patterns used actigraphy devices to observe 33 adults for 20 consecutive days and nights. They wanted to find out if modern industrial sleep patterns, where everyone is unconscious in roughly the same 8-hour block, are universal or culturally specific. What they found is striking. Over the entire study period, all the adults were simultaneously asleep for a total of only 18 minutes. 18 minutes in 20 days. For 99.8% of the night, at least one adult in the group was awake or in a state of very light sleep. This was not planned. No one organized formal guards or assigned sentries. It happened naturally, driven by variations in chronotypes. Someone is a natural night owl, someone an extreme early bird, and age-related differences in sleep architecture. Older Hadza adults slept more lightly and fragmentedly, waking often. Younger people had deeper, more consolidated sleep, but at different times. The pattern emerged from biology and individual differences, creating what researchers called a sentinel theory of sleep. The evolutionary logic here is undeniable. Deep sleep restores strength. It is necessary and non-negotiable. But it is also dangerous. You cannot react to threats. You cannot run from predators. You cannot fight off attackers. You cannot notice a fire, flood, or any other natural hazard until it is too late. Any population that regularly plunged into total collective unconsciousness would become easy prey. Therefore, humans appear to have evolved a solution. Variability. Distribute sleep times within the group so that someone is always at least partially awake. Mix chronotypes. Have enough people whose sleep is light or fragmented so that the probability of everyone being unconscious at the same time drops to nearly zero. Use genetics and age structure to create a system of rotational vigilance that is never formally organized but always functioning. Sailors knew this instinctively. They didn't invent the rotation of watches because someone decided it was a good idea. They did it because if everyone on a ship sleeps at once, it is suicide. The weather changes. The vessel veers off course. Equipment fails. Someone must always be awake, and human biology provided the template. Distribute the time. Break sleep into manageable chunks. Because total, uninterrupted rest is a luxury one cannot afford when the environment punishes a loss of consciousness. The military understood this as well. Sentries, perimeter security, duty rotations, all to ensure the camp was never fully vulnerable. Some of this was formal organization, of course, but it also worked because humans are built for it. We can function with interrupted sleep if we must. Our sleep architecture adapts. We don't drop dead after one interrupted night, because our ancestors, who couldn't cope with fragmented sleep, died before they could leave offspring. This was the first way sleep nearly killed us, not because we lacked it, but because we needed it at all. The biological imperative of unconsciousness. A few hours every night, when we are helpless and non-responsive. That was the vulnerability. Segmented sleep, sentinel systems, curfew bells, night watches, all were humanity's attempts to mitigate an unavoidable biological risk. Total, deep, uninterrupted 8-hour sleep was never the norm. It was a luxury most people throughout history could not afford for safety reasons. You slept when you could, as deeply as you dared, and periodically woke up to make sure the night hadn't killed you yet. Then you covered the fire, listened to the darkness, and hoped you would live until dawn. Most nights you did, but the fear never fully went away, because in a world without electric light, security alarms, and fire departments, unconsciousness was not rest. It was a calculated gamble you took every single night. Then something changed. Not overnight and not everywhere at once, but gradually, over to centuries. Humanity began to dismantle the architecture of darkness that had governed our nights. For 300,000 years, it all started with tallow-rendered animal fat cast on a wick. Tallow candles had existed for millennia, but they were expensive enough that most households used them sparingly. The poor relied on rushlights, literally, rush stems soaked in fat, which burned for about 20 minutes and gave off light roughly equivalent to a burning cigarette. Smoky, dim, pathetic. But it was light. And light meant you could extend your waking hours after sunset, if only for a short while. Beeswax was better, much better, giving a brighter and cleaner flame. But it was a luxury item monopolized by the church and the very wealthy. In Britain, the government taxed candles starting in 1709, intentionally keeping artificial light expensive and leaving the night dark for everyone, except those who could afford to buy their way out of the biological rhythms that had governed human existence since the dawn of the species. But by the end of the 18th century, technology began to catch up with demand. Oil lamps improved significantly. The argon lamp, developed in the 1780s, used a hollow circular wick and a glass tube, providing a flame intensity equivalent to about 10 ordinary candles. Suddenly, if you could afford whale oil or refined vegetable oils, you could turn your living room into something approaching daylight. Not quite, of course, but enough that reading, sewing, and painstaking work became possible for several hours after sunset. This was the first crack in the wall. Wealthy families began to treat the evening as a second day. Dinner shifted to a later time. Social gatherings lasted past 9 or 10 p.m. Coffee houses in London and Paris remained open, lit by dozens of oil lamps, creating spaces where men, mostly men, could meet, talk, and conduct business deep into the night. The traditional pattern of early to bed, because darkness left no alternative, began to crumble among those who could afford to fight it. But oil was still expensive. Lamps required constant maintenance, and the light, while better than candlelight, remained weak by modern standards. Most people, the vast majority of the population, still went to bed when the darkness thickened and woke with the return of light. The night still belonged to biology. And then came gas, and gas changed everything. The first gas street lighting appeared in London around 1813. Westminster Bridge shone with artificial flames bright enough to read by. Baltimore became the first American city lit by gas in 1816. By 1823, there were about 40,000 gas streetlights in London, covering more than 200 miles of streets. By 1880, this number exploded to about 1 million lamps. The city had killed its darkness. The efficiency was staggering. A single gas burner could produce 12 times more light than a candle or oil lamp, while the cost of operating it was 75% lower. This was not a gradual improvement. It was a revolution. For the first time in human history, bright light became cheap enough that middle-class businesses, and eventually ordinary households, could afford to flood their rooms with artificial light for several hours every night. And they did. Theaters stayed open late, with performances running past midnight. Shops extended their hours, with gas lamps blazing in the windows to attract customers who no longer had to rush home before dark. Museums, restaurants, oyster bars, entertainment venues, they all colonized the night, creating a commercial and social infrastructure that competed directly with sleep. The cultural shift happened faster than anyone expected. By the mid-19th century, major European and American cities had acquired a genuine nightlife. These were not the secretive, dangerous torch-lit encounters of previous centuries, but a legitimate evening culture. Middle-class families attended late concerts. Workers stopped by gas-lit pubs after shifts that now lasted past sunset, because factories also had gas lighting, extending productive hours far beyond what candles had ever allowed. And the watch that interval between the first and second sleep began to shrink. When your evening entertainment doesn't end until 11 p.m., you don't fall into your first sleep at 9. You stay awake, you participate in life, you push your bedtime further and further back. And when you finally fall asleep, you are so exhausted that you drop into a deep unconsciousness and stay there. Or you try to stay there, because morning still comes just as early. And now you have, say, 6 hours instead of the 8 or 9 you might have received into separate portions. Historical chronicles record this transition in real time. Mentions of first and second sleep, which abounded in European texts before 1700, began to decline sharply throughout the 18th century. By the end of the 19th century, they had practically disappeared. Medical texts stopped mentioning the watch as a normal feature of healthy sleep. Legal documents stopped tying events to it. Literature stopped using it as a narrative device. The cultural memory of segmented sleep was actively being erased, replaced by a new expectation. One long continuous block of unconsciousness, preferably 8 hours, preferably without waking. Roger Eckerk, the historian who performed the most extensive work in this field, argues that artificial lighting didn't just make this shift possible, it made it inevitable. Once it became cheap to light the night, once evening hours turned into valuable time rather than dead time, the economic and social pressure to compress sleep became irresistible. Every hour you spent awake in the middle of the night, that same old period of the watch, was an hour you weren't participating in the illuminated world. An hour you wasted, and increasingly an hour you couldn't afford to waste, because morning came according to a factory schedule, not when you naturally woke up after your second sleep. At first, it was a matter of class, then it became universal. The wealthy were the first to adopt the fashion of late-night gatherings, when only they could afford the light for it. But as gas became cheaper, and even cheaper electricity followed, this pattern trickled down. Working-class families might not have hosted evening salons, but they lived in cities lit by gas lamps, worked in factories with gas or electric lighting, and faced the same pressure to synchronize their sleep with industrial schedules that didn't care about first sleep, second sleep, or any other sleep except the minimum amount necessary to keep a worker functioning. The poor followed the rich into consolidated sleep not because it was better or more natural, but because the economic system demanded it. Fixed wake-up times regardless of sunrise. Shift work organized by the clock rather than biological time. School starting at 8 a.m. regardless of whether children had slept enough. The entire social apparatus of modernity was built on a foundation that assumed people should sleep once, in one block, on a schedule, rather than reacting to darkness, light, and their own internal rhythms. Laboratory studies since then have confirmed what might have happened if we had preserved the darkness. In the 1990s, the National Institute of Mental Health conducted an experiment in which subjects spent 14 hours a day in total darkness. This is much longer than a natural night, but enough to remove artificial lighting as a variable. They almost immediately switched to biphasic sleep, 4 hours of sleep, then wakefulness, then another 3 or 4 hours of sleep. The pattern emerged spontaneously, without instructions, suggesting that segmented sleep may be our natural default state when light does not interfere. But light interfered everywhere. Artificially lit evenings compressed the night, pushed bedtime to a later hour, and left no room for intervals of wakefulness that no longer served any purpose. In a world where fire was locked in furnaces, where police patrolled lit streets, and the dangers of unconsciousness were eliminated by engineering, we killed the darkness, and by killing it, we killed the sleep pattern that governed human existence longer than we have been human. The question we never asked, because no one remembered the alternative anymore, was whether this was progress or simply a very successful adaptation to a fundamentally changed environment, and what we lost as a result of this exchange. The answer, when it finally came, did not come from doctors or scientists. It came from a bell, not a church bell calling for prayer, but a factory bell calling for work. In the early industrial era, time ceased to be something you live inside and became something that lives outside you, hanging on the wall, ticking in metal. For most of human history, work was defined by tasks and seasons. You plowed when the soil was ready, you harvested when the grain said it was time, you stopped when it became too dark to see your own hand. There were busy seasons and lulls, long summer days and short winter ones. Your body, the sun, and the work itself negotiated the schedule. Factories killed this contract. When steam engines and textile mills began to spread across Britain in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, they brought something new. Machines that had to run continuously to be profitable. A loom didn't care if the sun had risen. A steam engine didn't get tired. Investors who had just poured money into brick and iron didn't want their capital to sleep. Therefore, they imposed a different order. Factory owners hung large, precise mechanical clocks on the walls, synchronized with city time rather than the sunrise. They rang bells at 5 a.m., at 6 a.m. whenever they pleased. And if you weren't in your place when the bell stopped ringing, you were late. Be late too often and you were fired. Historians call this time discipline. Before industrialization, being late meant missing a meeting with other people who could wait or reschedule it. After industrialization, being late meant being out of sync with a machine that never forgave and never stopped. The bell did not negotiate, it dictated. Workdays in this new regime were brutal. 10 hours were considered moderate. 12, 14, 16 hours were not uncommon, especially in the early decades. Children in British cotton mills could legally be forced to work up to 12 hours a day between 5 a.m. and 9 p.m. according to the Cotton Mills Act of 1819, a law that staggeringly was intended to be a reform. Think about what this does to the human day. Even assuming only 12 hours of work, add the commute to and from the factory, meals, basic hygiene, perhaps a few minutes with family, and you are left with a pathetic scrap of time, into which sleep must fit. Not sleep into luxurious segments with a drift into dreams and a contemplative watch between them, but simply unconsciousness squeezed into whatever narrow gap exists between the end of the night shift and the morning bell. In the countryside, people could still, to some extent, adjust their labor to the light. In industrial cities, the relationship flipped. Light now gas, and soon electric adjusted to the factory. Gas lamps in shops and workshops eliminated the last reason to end the day at sunset. The night was no longer a natural boundary. It became an expense item in a ledger. In such conditions, the first and second sleep did not just fade away, they became impossible. If you have to stand at a machine at 6 a.m. 6 days a week, and you work until 7 or 8 p.m., you have no period of leisure in the middle of the night. You shut down. Your entire night turns into one desperate attempt to squeeze in enough unconsciousness to stay on your feet the next day. The old watch, that quiet interval between sleeps when people prayed, talked, had sex, or simply existed, now fell exactly at the time when you could least afford to be awake. Therefore, the industrial city did what industrial systems always do. It took a flexible, adaptive human rhythm and planed it down until it fit into the machine. But the workers were not machines. Bodies broke, minds failed, accidents, injuries, and early deaths occurred. And slowly, painfully, people began to rebel not only against low wages and dangerous conditions, but against the very duration of their wakefulness for the sake of the factory. In 1817, Welsh factory owner and social reformer Robert Owen gave this rebellion its most enduring slogan: 8 hours labor, 8 hours recreation, 8 hours sleep. This was not a scientific formula. Owen did not conduct controlled trials on the optimal duration of human sleep. It was a political demand, a vision of a world where the day is hacked into 3 equal parts rather than being consumed almost entirely by work. The beauty of this slogan lay in its symmetry. 24 hours, divided exactly into 3 parts. It was a catchy, rhythmic statement that was easy to print on posters. It reflected what workers had begun to feel in their gut. Their days were unnaturally skewed, and factories had stretched wakefulness to limits that no sane creature should endure. For decades, this dream remained only a dream. The struggle for the 8-hour workday met with fierce resistance from employers. In Britain, compromise measures, such as the 10 Hours Act of 1847, limited the work of women and adolescents in textile factories to only 10 hours a day. It was an improvement, but still far from Owen's elegant 8-8-8 division. Elsewhere, movements rose and were suppressed. Strikes were broken. Demonstrations turned bloody. People died under banners that demanded not revolution, not the overthrow of capitalism itself, but simply few hours at the machine. Gradually, however, the cracks widened across the world, especially after the social upheavals of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Governments began to codify shortened days into law. In the United States, the Adamson Act of 1916 established an 8-hour workday for interstate railroad workers, serving as a critical precedent. After World War I, countries like Germany established the 8-hour workday and the 48-hour workweek as industrial standards. Labor unions fought, negotiated, threatened, and occasionally won. And when this happened, something subtle occurred. Owen's slogan consisted of 3 parts: labor, recreation, sleep. Theoretically, recreation was exactly that time not controlled by the boss. It could include sleep, of course, but also eating, socializing, raising children, reading, church, anything that was not wage labor. The essence lay in political autonomy, not in the architecture of sleep. But when you slice the day into one large 8-hour work block, and one large 8-hour non-work block before or after it, the obvious solution suggests itself. Sleep all that time at once. Do not wake up in the middle of the night. Do not drift between states. Do not maintain a flexible, seasonally adaptable, socially negotiated pattern. Squeeze your biological needs into a neat, consolidated package that sits squarely next to your shift. Over time, the phrase from the slogan 8 hours of recreation began to transform in the public consciousness. It stopped sounding like a bargaining chip and started sounding like a prescription. 8 hours of recreation, 8 hours of sleep. 8 hours is what you need. Not because anyone proved that humans naturally require exactly that much time in one continuous block, but because that number happened to balance the industrial ledger. The rest of society followed suit. Schools, which once adjusted more freely to local agricultural or religious rhythms, were brought into alignment with the factory day. Children were expected to rise early, arrive on time, and sit in regulated rows mirroring the shop floor. Their parents' shifts dictated their bedtimes and the timing of morning alarms. The railroad system, built to move goods and workers on a precise schedule, reinforced a world where minutes mattered and being out of sync was a punishable offense. Public institutions standardized hours of operation. Banks, post offices, courts, shops all opened and closed by the clock rather than by sunlight. The entire social universe began to function on synchronized mechanical schedules. If your job, your child's school, transportation, and the ability to buy food depend on your being awake during the same block of hours, then your sleep must retreat into the only remaining continuous block, the night, unbroken, as long as possible. From the system's perspective, this was a triumph of rationality. The day was orderly, the night was intended for rest. Everyone knew when and where they were supposed to be. But from the perspective of human biology, something strange happened. A pattern that would likely have seemed alien to your pre-industrial ancestors. A single consolidated 8-hour stretch of unconsciousness was elevated to the status of a norm, even a naturalness, largely because it met the needs of machines and markets. Medical thinking adjusted accordingly. Physicians of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, immersed in societies organized around the 8-hour workday, began to speak of sleep in terms that assumed one long nocturnal block. Waking in the middle of the night, once so common that people had a word for the interval between sleeps, began to be pathologized. If you could not produce 8 hours of uninterrupted oblivion on demand, the problem was now with you, not the schedule. The irony is hard to miss. The number that dominates our cultural imagination, 8 hours of sleep as a kind of gold standard, did not emerge from careful studies of hunter-gatherers or long-term experiments on human longevity. It emerged from factory floors, strike committees, and legislative compromises. It was a political ceiling for work that quietly turned into a biological floor for rest. The factory bell that rang over darkened cities centuries ago did not just tell people when to wake up. It began to dictate to them how to sleep. And we are still living inside that sound. By the time legislators were finally writing the 8-hour workday into law, Another force was already creeping in that made even this victory seem temporary. It appeared not in the form of a bell, but in the form of a light bulb. Thomas Edison did not invent artificial light. Humans had fought darkness with fire for hundreds of thousands of years, with tallow dips and wax candles, whale oil and gas jets. But all these earlier types of light had two critical limitations. They were expensive and fragile. You didn't burn candles all night for fun, unless you were very rich. You didn't flood entire cities with gaslight without worrying about explosions and leaks. Edison's incandescent lamp promised something different. Cheap, controlled, seemingly infinite light at the flick of a switch. In 1879, when Edison publicly demonstrated his practical incandescent bulb, he wasn't just selling a gadget, he was selling a vision. In his world, darkness was not a natural rhythm, but a problem requiring a solution. Sleep, in his view, was part of that problem. In interviews, he boasted that he needed only about 4 hours of sleep a day. He described sleep as a kind of waste, a theft of productive time. Later, authors quoted him as saying that sleep is a criminal waste of time, and regardless of whether he uttered that exact phrase, it captures the essence of his attitude. He slept strategically short naps with steel balls in his hand, of course, to wake up when they dropped. But for him, long nocturnal sleep was a structural matter to be re-engineered. Electric light was his solution. In 1882, when his Pearl Street station in New York began supplying electricity to a grid of consumers, an abstract invention turned into infrastructure. Gas lamps hissed, flickered, and required skilled lamplighters for maintenance. Electric lamps needed none of that. You could run the wiring, flick a switch, and banish the night from a room for as long as you were willing to pay the bill. Cities changed fast. Streets that were dim, even under gaslight, turned into bright corridors of glass and metal. Shop windows glowed in the evening. Factories, which had already extended their hours with gas, now lit entire production halls with brighter, more even, and safer light. In the following decades, as generation and wiring systems improved, gas lamps once considered revolutionary were dismantled. The lamplighter, a quintessential figure of 19th century streets, became a relic of the past. Candles and gas began the siege of the night. Electricity completed it. The consequences went far beyond mere convenience. For hundreds of thousands of years, the circadian rhythm of human life was tightly linked to a single and powerful environmental signal: the rising and setting of the sun. Your ancestors might have sheltered a fire in a cave or a hut, but outside, the celestial light was the primary chronometer. Dawn woke you. Twilight settled you. The real night told your body at a cellular level that it was time to shift into a different mode. In your head, this transition is coordinated by a network of neurons in the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmat. IC nucleus, the body's master clock. It keeps an approximate count of time on its own, but it also listens to your eyes, not the parts that form images, but a special set of light-sensitive cells that do not care about shapes, but do care about brightness and color. When these cells see daylight, especially the blue spectrum-rich light of the sun, they send a message. It is day. Stay alert. Hold back the nighttime chemistry. One of the key elements of this chemistry is melatonin, a hormone secreted by the pineal gland. Under natural conditions, melatonin levels rise in the evening as light fades. It helps coordinate the transition to night mode by lowering body temperature, slowing metabolism, and inducing a feeling of sleepiness. In a dark world, this signal is strong and clear. Electric light distorts it. Expose a person to bright light during their biological night, and you can cut melatonin production in half. It is especially sensitive to shortwave light of a blue hue, the kind you get not only from the midday sky, but also from many modern LEDs and screens. To your clock, this light is a lie. A fake dawn at 10 p.m., a miniature noon at midnight. When this lie is repeated every evening, day after day, something subtle yet profound occurs. Your internal night shifts to a later time. The release of melatonin is delayed. The point in your 24-hour cycle when your body expects sleep, Your circadian sleep window shifts toward the pre-dawn hours. Biologically, you transform into something more of a night owl, even if your genes would have placed you somewhere earlier on that spectrum. By firelight and candlelight, this effect existed but was limited. Low levels of warm orange light have little impact on melatonin. With gas, the impact was stronger. With bright electric lighting, especially as bulbs became cheaper and more efficient, the pressure became relentless, and the social world adjusted accordingly. If factories with gas lamps could stretch work into the evening, factories with electric light could stretch it into infinity. The same infrastructure that lit the streets and exhibition halls made it economically rational to run machines all night long. Why let capital sit idle in the dark when you can pack the night with shifts? Shift work in its basic form had existed before. Night watchmen, bakers, ship crews. But electrification industrialized it. You could divide the day into 2 shifts, then 3. You could run 24-hour steel mills, textile factories, and telephone exchanges. Workers took turns living in defiance of the sun. Entertainment followed suit. Cafes and music halls, which once closed at reasonable hours, stayed open longer and longer. Thanks to safe, bright lights, crowds could be gathered at midnight without the former fear of crime or fire. Neon signs and illuminated billboards turned the night into a marketplace. The city never truly slept. It simply pulsed. In the 20th century, another layer was added. First came radio, then television, then digital networks, which quietly wove the globe into a single nervous system. Electric light freed people from the darkness. Electronics freed them from each other's time zones. Somewhere, it was always day. Somewhere, someone was awake, sending a message you might feel obligated to answer. Each of these steps factories, nightlife, screens led human activity further away from the solar cycle, and deeper into what might be called the electric cycle, the rhythm of networks, markets, and global communications. For the system, this was an incredible gain in flexibility. For individual bodies, it became an invitation to chronic misalignment. Chronobiologists have a phrase for the result: social jet lag. When you fly across time zones, you feel the mismatch between the clock on the wall and the clock in your head as lethargy, digestive oddities, and mood swings. Your internal night is still where you flew from, even though the sun has moved. Social jet lag is the same phenomenon, but without the airplane. Your internal clock, shaped by light exposure, might be set for ideal sleep from midnight to 8 a.m. Your job, commute, and children's school insist that you be fully functional at 7 a.m. You live as if every Monday morning you fly several time zones to the east and crawl home exhausted. Every Friday night, researchers like Till Roenberg measure this by looking at the difference between when people sleep on workdays and when they sleep on their days off. In many industrial populations, more than 2/3 of people show a discrepancy of at least 1 hour. For a large portion, it is 2 hours or more. Their bodies want to sleep and wake later than schedules allow. The alarm clock becomes not a reminder, but a daily act of violence against their biology. How this affects health is still being studied. Large observational studies link high levels of social jet lag to an increased risk of obesity, metabolic problems, and cardiovascular markers. Performance suffers, mood suffers. None of this proves a simple, one-way causal link. People are complex, as are their lives. But the pattern is hard to ignore. By candlelight and starlight, your ancestors' biggest sleep problem was staying unconscious long enough to avoid being eaten, robbed, or burned. With electric light, the problem flipped. The danger is not that the world will invade your sleep by force. It is that you will be tempted or compelled to invade it yourself, night after night, until your internal clock loses its bearings. By the early 20th century, two massive shifts converged. Industrial time disciplines sliced the day into rigid work blocks, and elevated 8 continuous hours of night sleep to the rank of an ideal. Electrification dissolved the natural boundaries of that night, and gave both employers and individuals the ability to ignore their own darkness almost at will. The stage was set for a collision. An ancient nervous system, tuned by millions of years of sunrises and sunsets, crashed into a world that could mimic daytime indefinitely and demand alertness on command. And as we shall see, the price of this collision would be more than just a few sleepy mornings. In some cases, the price was measured in smashed machines, blazing factories, derailed trains, and lives suddenly cut short. The first serious warning did not come in the form of a medical study or a TED Talk. It appeared as a plume of radioactive steam. On March 28, 1979, at 4 a.m., at the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania, failures began. A valve stuck open, cooling water began to drain away. In a control room full of flashing lights and sleepy operators who had been on duty for many hours, working at the deadest point of the human circadian cycle, sirens wailed. What they saw on the panels did not match what was happening inside the reactor. In those first critical minutes, they misinterpreted the situation. They shut down systems that should have been running. They tried to solve the wrong problem. One could list all the contributing factors: poor control room design, confusing indicators, training gaps, management culture. This is exactly what investigators did. But running through it all like a red thread was something simpler and more ancient. A human brain was trying to solve complex problems at a time of day when evolution never intended it to be responsible for anything more dangerous than a campfire. The result was a partial core meltdown. Less than a decade later, on the other side of the world, the scenario repeated itself, but on a much worse scale. Chernobyl, Ukraine, April 26, 1986. Time: 1:23 a.m. The reactor staff had already gone through a long and chaotic workday. A planned safety test had been repeatedly delayed, rescheduled, and finally pushed deep into the night shift. By the time the experiment began, operators were performing a complex, poorly understood procedure on an unstable reactor during a period when human alertness is at its lowest. Again, it wasn't just about sleep. The reactor design was flawed. The test was poorly planned, and political pressure and safety violations played a role. But when investigators reconstructed the timeline, they returned again and again to the same theme. The people in that control room made a cascade of wrong decisions. While in a state of cognitive impairment, they were required to be precise at an hour when biology was pushing them toward oblivion. This time, the price was not just a damaged plant, but an explosion that blew the roof off the reactor, scattered radioactive materials across Europe, and turned an entire region into an exclusion zone. And between these two nuclear catastrophes, on a cold Alaskan night, another tragedy unfolded. On March 24, 1989, the Exxon Valdez, a massive oil tanker, leaves the port of Valdez. Shortly after midnight, the captain leaves the bridge. A tired third mate takes the helm, trying to steer the vessel past the ice. The National Transportation Safety Board later concluded that his actions were inadequate, likely due to fatigue. The crew was too small for such a workload, shifts were long, and rest was insufficient. In the end, 95,000 square kilometers of ocean and coastline were smothered in crude oil. Again, the causes were many, but at the helm during those fatal minutes was a man systematically deprived of the only resource that makes our large and expensive brains work correctly: sleep. This is not a conspiracy theory. Government reports and engineering analyses consistently point to the same thing. When you operate critical systems 24/7 and staff them with sleep-deprived people, you are consciously operating on the edge of disaster. The space program was not immune either. Before the Challenger launch in 1986, engineers and managers argued late into the night via teleconference about the risks of cold weather launch. A human factors analysis later noted that some of the key decision makers had slept very little, if at all, before giving the go in the early morning hours. Fatigue did not blow up the shuttle on its own, but it dulled the sharpness of judgment at a moment when every nuance mattered. These are not just curious anecdotes. They are symptoms. You only have to start looking, and you will see the same fingerprints. Extended shifts, circadian minimums, and chronic sleep restriction in aviation, railroads, trucking, and medicine. Everywhere the 24/7 world touches the human nervous system and demands it work as if it, too, were made of steel and silicon. Take the roads. Official U.S. statistics show drowsy driving in only a small fraction of fatal accidents. But sleep leaves no skid marks. When sleep researchers try to estimate the real scale, some cite figures an order of magnitude higher, thousands of deaths annually. The mechanisms are simple and brutal. As wakefulness persists, especially past the usual bedtime, reactions slow, and attention flickers. Microsleeps appear terrifying lapses of a fraction of a second when the brain simply shuts down. At highway speeds, a 1-second lapse is the difference between adjusting your trajectory and veering into the oncoming lane. In aviation, fatigue constantly appears in incident reports. Pilots working long shifts or crossing multiple time zones demonstrate the exact same cognitive erosion as participants in laboratory experiments. Narrowing of the field of vision, slowing of reactions, errors in judgment. In 2010, Air India Express Flight 812 overran the runway and crashed. Investigators pointed to the captain, who had fallen asleep during the flight and was disoriented upon waking. During the final stage of the approach, a single human brain, lacking a few hours of sleep, suddenly became the weakest link in a chain of metal and software. But nowhere does this paradox manifest as acutely as in medicine. Throughout much of the 20th century, the culture of medical training viewed sleep deprivation as a kind of rite of passage. Young doctors' residents were expected to work 36 hours straight. It was believed that this forged character. Reality, however, showed that it breeds errors. A study in intensive care units revealed, when shifts were shortened and doctors were given time to sleep, the number of serious medical errors didn't just decrease, it plummeted. One randomized trial showed that interns on old schedules made 5 times as many serious diagnostic errors. The wrong medications, missed lab results, failure to notice a critical deterioration in a patient's condition in time. Behind these numbers stand real names and funerals. We built a system that takes the people to whom we entrust our lives, places them under fluorescent lights at 3 a.m., and demands 8-hour alertness as something that can be summoned by an act of will. Sound familiar? On a societal scale, these catastrophes are a modern mirror image of your ancestors' dilemma. For hundreds of thousands of years, the danger of sleep was simple. If you fell too deeply asleep in a hostile world, you might not wake up. Today, the world is still dangerous when you are unconscious, but the greater threat often comes from being awake at the wrong time, doing the wrong work with the wrong brain. Sleep nearly killed us once because we couldn't avoid it in a world of predators and fire. Today, sleep nearly kills us because we try to avoid it in a world of reactors, tankers, and high-speed trains. No one in those control rooms woke up thinking, "Today I will cause a catastrophe." They were doing what the system expected of them. Edison's cultural mindset, that sleep is a luxury and a waste of time, has frozen into shift schedules and economic incentives. But sleep is not impressed by markets or quarterly reports. It can be delayed or fragmented, but the bill will eventually be presented. To understand why this bill is so high, we need to look inside the organ that pays this price, into the sleeping brain itself. The first surprise: sleep is not a uniform state. From the outside, it looks boring. Closed eyes, lack of reaction, perhaps light snoring. From the inside, however, it is like a play in 4 acts that repeats over and over with different events in each. Approximately every 90 minutes, you pass through a cycle. Stage N1: light sleep, the threshold where thoughts begin to melt and turn into images. It is a shaky bridge between worlds. Muscles relax, brain waves slow down. You are easily awakened. Stage N2: here. The brain begins to generate sleep spindles and K-complexes, bursts of electrical activity. They handle the bookkeeping, filtering sensory information so the noise of cars outside doesn't wake you, and starting the process of encoding memories. Stage N3 Deep Slow Wave Sleep. Slow delta waves roll across the cerebral cortex. Heart rate and blood pressure drop. This is the restoration stage. Muscles heal microtraumas, and growth hormone is produced. But it is also cleaning time. Between brain cells, the channels of the glymphatic system open. The space between neurons expands, and cerebrospinal fluid begins to literally wash away metabolic waste, including beta amyloids, proteins associated with dementia. The brain takes out the trash during the night shift, while the streets are quiet. In this same stage, facts and skills are transferred from short-term buffers to stable neural networks. Stage REM, Rapid Eye Movement Sleep. The brain suddenly becomes as active as when awake. Eyes dart under the eyelids, but skeletal muscles are paralyzed, so you don't act out your dreams in reality. Here, your emotional life is edited. You process the fears and joys of the day, but in a different chemical composition without stress hormones. This allows memories to lose their painful edge while retaining their meaning. REM sleep also helps reorganize motor skills. If you practice piano during the day, at night the brain consolidates these connections. This is not magic. It is architecture. During a typical night, these 90-minute cycles repeat 4 to 6 times. In the beginning of the night, you get more slow-wave sleep, body restoration, waste cleanup. Later, especially closer to dawn, REM episodes become longer and more complex. This already tells us something important. Whatever ideal sleep may be, it is not just about the total number of minutes. It is about giving your brain time to pass through several full cycles, enough runs through the car wash to wash away both the dirt and the insects. So who runs this schedule? Why does it happen at night rather than in the middle of the day, or in the form of 4 evenly distributed short sleep periods? Here we encounter the second surprise. You don't have one sleep system. You have 2, and they are constantly pulling each other in different directions. In the 1980s, Swiss scientist Alexander Borby described what is now called the 2-process model of sleep. Process S is your homeostatic sleep drive. The longer you stay awake, the more pressure builds up, seeking to knock you out. Process C is your circadian rhythm, that very 24-hour clock in your brain that says, now is the time to be awake, now is the time to sleep. Process S is essentially a biological hourglass. Throughout the day, your brain burns energy and produces byproducts, such as adenosine. Adenosine molecules slowly clog specific receptors, especially in areas regulating alertness, making you feel heavy and sluggish. When you finally fall asleep, especially in the deep sleep phase, the adenosine is cleared out, the hourglass is flipped, and it all starts over. Meanwhile, Process C is located in a tiny cluster of neurons in the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It counts time by reading light. Morning sunlight hits the receptors in your eyes and effectively tells the clock, the day begins now. Based on this schedule, levels of hormones such as melatonin and cortisol rise and fall. Body temperature and metabolism follow suit. You feel drowsy when these 2 processes coincide. When your homeostatic drive S is high, and your circadian clock C points to night, you feel a strange agitation at 11 p.m. after a time zone shift because the clock and the hourglass are out of sync. A pile of adenosine is pulling you down, while circadian signals are trying to keep you up. Caffeine, by the way, works by wedging itself into adenosine receptors and blocking the "you are tired" message, without actually removing the adenosine itself. The hourglass continues to fill. When the caffeine lets go, all that accumulated supply crashes down on you at once. This is the caffeine crash. Combine Process S and Process C, and you get a pattern that, in most adults, nudges them toward a consolidated block of night sleep and a slight dip in the middle of the day. This is the biological skeleton. Culture wraps clocks and schedules around it. But here the story becomes even more tangled and human. Not everyone's circadian clocks run the same way. In some people, the internal day is shorter. They want to sleep at 9 p.m. and wake up at 5 a.m. Honestly, they like it. These are larks. In others, the clock runs longer. Their peak alertness is shifted to a later time. They only hit their mental stride by evening, and sleep tries to pull them into its nets somewhere after midnight. These are owls. These tendencies can be adjusted with light and habits, but it is not just a choice or laziness. Studies of twins and genetics show that chronotype depends on variants of clock genes, such as per and clock. Some people are born out of sync with the 9-to-5 world. When you squeeze everyone into a single schedule school at 7:30 a.m. for teenagers, whose clocks naturally run late night shifts for larks, whose biology begs for sleep at 10 p.m., you are not creating a level playing field. You are creating systemic winners and losers. The brain, of course, does not give up. If you shorten sleep, especially for a night or two, it begins to perform triage. In a compressed stretch of sleep, the proportion of deep and REM sleep often increases. The brain tries to protect the most critical stages. There is also a more dramatic version of this REM rebound. If you suppress REM sleep by waking a person every time they enter it, then during free sleep, dream periods become much longer. The brain rushes to the stage it was denied, as if insisting, "This part of the night matters. You won't be able to skip it forever." With prolonged sleep restriction, this compensation breaks down. Performance falls, reaction time slows, nerves give way, even if people swear they feel fine. Sleep architecture is flexible. It is more like a just score than a factory whistle. Structured, rhythmic, full of recurring motifs, but capable of improvising through interruptions. The problem is not that our sleep system is rigid and fragile. The problem is that we have built socio-economic systems that assume it is infinitely plastic. And then we are surprised when biology fights back. When someone authoritatively states, "You must sleep 8 hours a day, otherwise you are killing yourself," it sounds scientific. But there is one problem. If you look at the data tracking who lives and who dies over decades, the magic number is not 8. It is closer to 7. In the early 2000s, sleep researcher Daniel Kripke and his colleagues studied tens of thousands of people. When they plotted sleep duration against the risk of death, the result was not a straight line, but a U-shaped curve. In people reporting about 7 hours of sleep, mortality was lowest. Moving to the left towards 6 or 5 hours, the risk increased. Moving to the right 9, 10, 11 hours, it increased again. Later, a massive meta-analysis of 2.2 million adults confirmed this pattern. 7 hours is at the bottom of the curve. At 6 hours, the risk is slightly higher. At 9 hours, the risk is clearly higher than at 7. By 11 hours, the risk is comparable to those who sleep the least. What should we do with this? First, notice that the ideal is not a sheer cliff at the 8-hour mark, but a gentle valley around 7 with a wide, forgiving floor. 6.5, 7.5, and even 8 are all in the same prosperous zone. Why does this U-shaped curve exist? On the short sleep side, there are clear biological reasons. Those who sleep less than 6 hours are more likely to suffer from obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and cardiovascular disease. On the long sleep side, things are more complex. Most likely, for many, long sleep is not the cause of high mortality, but its symptom. People with depression, chronic inflammation, or cancer sleep more because their bodies are trying to fight the disease. The illness itself shortens life and forces one to sleep for 10 hours. The U-shaped curve is real and reliable. It tells us that 7 hours is good. It suggests that sleeping much less is bad for the heart. It does not say there is a universal commandment of 8 or death. That commandment came from culture. In 2017, neuroscientist Matthew Walker published the book Why We Sleep. It became a hit. Its central message: adults need 8 hours of sleep as a non-negotiable biological requirement. Anything less is a breach in health and memory. This provided immense benefits by making sleep a topic of public discussion. But later, specialists began to verify the book's claims. Programmer Alexei Guzzi wrote a methodical critique, pointing out factual errors and even a graph where inconvenient data points had been removed, for the sake of a beautiful trend line. The main grievance is not that Walker was wrong about everything. Chronic sleep deprivation is indeed harmful. The problem is precision and fear. 8 hours or the brain will collapse is a powerful headline, but the evidence doesn't say that. When people accept this as truth, sleep itself becomes a source of anxiety. You lie in bed at 11:47 p.m., counting the hours until the alarm at 6:30 a.m. and panicking. That's less than 8 hours. My brain cells are dying. My Alzheimer's risk is rising right now. The heart rate increases, stress hormones spike, and sleep drifts even further away. We have turned a biological necessity into a performance metric. On the other side is hustle culture. The idea that winners sleep 45 hours, and fatigue is a weakness to be treated with coffee and discipline. This story is just as flawed. For most, 5 hours is not enough. You can hold out on willpower for a while, but your reactions and emotional control will degrade. You are burning the furniture to keep the lights on in the house. If we set aside the extremes, a more complex picture emerges. The need for sleep is individual. It changes with age. Teenagers need more. It depends on genetics. There are rare mutations that allow functioning on 6 hours, and there are those who need 9. It depends on what your day looks like. Whether you are training for a marathon, recovering from an illness, or experiencing heavy cognitive load, general epidemiological curves do not negate this individuality. These are averages. The claim that 7 hours is the minimum for mortality applies to the population level, rather than being a personal prescription. So what should you do with all this? You are a specific person in a specific body, living under specific pressures in a world that speaks about rest in mutually exclusive phrases. Use science not as a whip, but as a compass. You know that chronically restricting sleep to less than 6 hours is likely a poor long-term strategy, no matter how noble the cause. You know that sleeping 11 hours every day, without an obvious reason, might be a signal worth discussing with a doctor, rather than just a quirk. But you also know there is no sacred commandment stating that 8 o'clock is the only safe password to longevity. If you consistently wake up without an alarm after 7 hours, feel alert during the day, and don't crash on weekends to catch up, the data suggests you are likely in a healthy zone. Even if the cultural script insists you are missing an hour, the real rule isn't 8 hours or death. It is quieter and more demanding. Your body has a need for sleep. It will change throughout your life. It won't always coincide with what work or culture wants from you. Learn to hear that voice. Pay attention to how you feel, not just what the clock shows. And when possible, range your waking world so that the sleeping brain can perform that deep cyclic work. It rehearsed long before factories, clocks, or self-help books tried to impose a notion of normal upon it. Until now, we have mostly talked about numbers. 7 hours, 8 hours, U-shaped curves, and mortality risk. But if we move away from the tables and look at real life in real cultures, another thing becomes obvious. The way you and I are told to sleep in one clean block at night, without naps, without dozing at work is not some eternal biological law. It is an accent, a local dialect of sleep that most of the world has never spoken. Let's leave the Anglo-American world for a minute, the land of power through the afternoon slump, and coffee's foreclosures, and step into a small Spanish town before the era of air conditioning and global conference calls. The sun is merciless. Stone walls radiate heat like an oven. You have lunch at 2 or 3 in the afternoon. After that comes a pause. Shops close their shutters. The streets go silent. People lie down. The siesta was not a lazy whim tacked onto a normal day. It was the backbone of the schedule. You divided waking hours into 2 distinct chunks. A morning work block, then a long afternoon break, and then an evening and night block that often lasted until late. Work, rest, work. Waking, sleep, waking. And this pattern corresponded not only to the climate, but to the body. If you connect people to thermometers and EEGs and remove social schedules, no email, no school bells, No meetings. Something remarkably stubborn is discovered. In most people, there is a slump in alertness and a drop in core body temperature in the early afternoon, roughly between 1 p.m. and 3:30 p.m. This happens even if everyone is fed identically at different times. It's not just I ate too much pasta. It's hardwired into our circadian mechanism, a little twilight inside the day. Siesta cultures simply listen to this. Mediterranean and many Latin American cities historically built everything around this lull. The hottest and least productive hours turned into sanctioned sleep. Now look at what happens when industrial time begins to push. Factories don't like pauses. Global markets don't care about the midday sun. During the 20th century, Spain and Italy found themselves under growing pressure. The need to synchronize with Central and Northern Europe. Continuous working hours, standardized closing times, TV schedules, train timetables. Cultural memory of the siesta remains strong. You can still buy postcards on the subject. But daily practice eroded. Surveys in the 2000s and 2010s showed that most Spaniards no longer sleep during the day on workdays. Biology hasn't changed. The afternoon slump hasn't disappeared. But the schedules have. And this is a recurring theme in the modern history of sleep. Cultural pressure overrides flexible biology and then pretends that what survived is the norm. If you jump from Madrid to Tokyo, you won't find a siesta. You will find something stranger. In Japan, there is a practice called inimuri. It translates roughly as being present while sleeping. Imagine a person on a crowded commuter train, head nodding, eyes closed, briefcase on their lap, or an office worker in a meeting, quietly dozing at the edge of the table. They aren't fired. They aren't shamed for weakness. Often, this is interpreted as a hidden compliment. This person is so dedicated, so overworked, that they have to steal micro-rests wherever they can. Sociologists note that inimuri is regulated by rules. You aren't allowed to check out completely, you still must, in some sense, be there. But behind this etiquette lies a simple reality. Japan never fully accepted the Anglo-Saxon rule that sleep is only possible in one big block. At home in pajamas. Public micro-sleep is tolerated and even respected here. And now look where no one can decide that sleep is sacred. Because the environment doesn't care about your circadian ideals. Alone in an ocean regatta, on a 60-foot boat during a storm, you cannot switch off for 8 hours. There is no night through and through. The wind doesn't adjust to your REM cycles. Therefore, solo sailors learn to do what our culture calls impossible. Live on distributed sleep. 20 minutes here, 40 minutes there, an hour when the weather is stable. Days or weeks on end, without a single consolidated block. For decades, Brazilian-Italian researcher Claudio Stampi studied these people. He tracked more than 100 sailors, connected them to sensors, and asked a tough question. If you can't get normal sleep, what way of cheating will be the least harmful? When he restricted volunteers to about 3 hours of total sleep per day, which is severe deprivation, he tried two strategies. One long chunk or many ultra-short naps scattered throughout the day. The one block group felt terrible. They were sluggish and cognitively falling apart. The nappers fared better. Their reaction times and decision-making remained much more stable. The EEG showed a striking thing. Even when sleep is broken into tiny pieces, the total ratio of REM and slow-wave sleep over 24 hours remained remarkably stable. The architecture was preserved, just compressed and redistributed. In other words, human sleep is not a fragile crystal that shatters if not given 8 continuous hours on an orthopedic pillow. It is more like a shapeshifter. When it has 2, it can pack the most important processes into any scraps of time. The military, truck drivers, polar expeditions, and astronauts all face the same fact. Biology wants sleep, but it can survive by getting it in many different ways. This doesn't mean you should switch to an extreme polyphasic schedule. Stampi found something more modest and interesting. If total sleep time must be limited, then splitting it intelligently is better than chaotic destruction. While sailors and soldiers improvise in extreme conditions, in the fluorescent heart of the modern world, Sleep has begun to quietly emerge from the corner of shame. In the 1990s, a NASA study showed that a 40-minute sleep window for pilots, of which they slept an average of 26 minutes, increased alertness by 50% and performance by more than 30%. A short daytime nap was a pure victory. Such data became a tasty morsel for corporations. Google installed sleep pods, airports began to rent them out. In business journals, the midday nap began to be called not laziness, but optimization. You can see this cultural shift in the language itself. People don't say I lay down because I was tired. They say I'm using a 20-minute power nap to increase productivity. The behavior is the same, the story is different. One can be cynical about this, but it punctured a hole in the myth of the single 8-hour block. The idea that real adults sleep only once at night is merely a specific cultural script that spread from industrial England and America. Here is the irony. As soon as you build a world around an 8-hour block, clocks, shifts, school bells, you change not only how people sleep, but also what is considered a disease. For most of history, if you woke up at 1 in the morning and looked at the ceiling for an hour, it was not considered a symptom. It was just night. Historian Roger Eckert, in his research, discovered that in pre-industrial Europe, people habitually spoke of first sleep and second sleep. Court records, diaries, even prayer books mention this as a matter of course. You went to bed after sunset, slept for several hours, woke up around midnight, and did something. Threw wood on the fire, checked the livestock, prayed. There were even special prayers for the interval between the first and second sleep. You whispered with your spouse, had sex, told stories. Then, an hour or two later, you fell asleep again. This was the second sleep. No one wrote, "I'm afraid I have insomnia in the middle of the night." They called it the watch. In the 1990s, psychiatrist Thomas Ware conducted an experiment. He placed people in long winter night conditions, 14 hours of darkness, without phones or the internet. At first, the participants simply caught up on sleep, but after a while, their sleep split into two chunks with a quiet period of wakefulness in the middle. Without industrial lighting, their brains returned to the pattern of first and second sleep. This raises an uncomfortable question. What if what many describe today as I wake up at 3 a.m. and can't sleep is not a system failure? What if it is an ancient pattern trying to break through a new social script, but we treat it differently? In the 19th century, as schedules tightened, any deviation received the label insomnia. It was in this era that the march of sedatives began. First, crude chemical hammers like bromide salts or chloral hydrate, which turned restlessness into a coma with the grace of a shovel. Then, in the early 1900s, barbiturates appeared. They were advertised as a miracle. A doctor could fix your disobedient sleep with a pill. It didn't matter that they were addictive and destroyed the natural architecture of sleep. They made you unconscious, and for a world that equated sleep with switching off for a fixed term, that was enough. By the middle of the century, the price became obvious. Addiction, deaths from mixing with alcohol, seizures during withdrawal. Then came the next wave. Benzodiazepines, Librium, Valium, and then sleeping pills like Halcyon. Advertisements showed calm housewives and businessmen finally getting their deserved 8 hours. These drugs were milder than barbiturates but still distorted sleep, caused addiction, and left a feeling of sluggishness. And as they spread, the feedback loop tightened even further. The more powerful tools we had for imposing a narrow vision of normal sleep, the more everything that fell outside those boundaries began to seem like a pathology. Don't sleep all night through. A disorder. Need a daytime nap. A disorder. Woke up at 2 in the morning with a clear head. A disorder. Well, unless you start panicking about it, then it's definitely a disorder. By the end of the 20th century, sleep had become a medical specialty. The American Academy of Sleep Medicine, originally the American Association of Sleep Disorders, was formed in the 1970s. Its task became the definition, diagnosis, and treatment of sleep problems. The first accredited centers appeared by 1977. By the 2000s, There were thousands of them in North America alone. This is not a conspiracy. Much of this work saves lives. Diagnosing sleep apnea prevents strokes and heart attacks. Understanding narcolepsy or restless leg syndrome changes people's lives. But stitched inside this progress is a quiet cultural project. Writing a rulebook on how a normal person should sleep. 8 hours, predominantly at night, in one piece. Fell asleep quickly, slept soundly, woke up refreshed. Anything else? Suspicious. Pharmaceutical companies saw an opportunity here. Benzodiazepines were replaced by Z-drugs Zolpidem, Sailplan, Zopiclone, which acted on the same receptors but were presented as providing a more clean and natural sleep. Ambien, approved in the US in 1992, became a blockbuster. Advertisements showed people sinking into silky, uninterrupted nights on demand. It later emerged that these drugs could distort sleep cycles, increase the risk of falls in the elderly, and cause strange behavior. For many insomnia sufferers, cognitive behavioral therapy works just as well. But by the time this nuance became clear, the cultural script had already taken root. You, a citizen of the 24/7 world, are obliged to sleep 8 hours. Exactly 8, preferably from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. If it doesn't work out, there's something wrong with you. Go to a doctor. Ask if this pill is right for you. And here we encounter a modern paradox. Tell millions of people that they must get a strictly defined amount of sleep, or their health will collapse and you will create the very problem you are trying to solve. It has a name. Sleep anxiety. You lie down. You look at the clock. Okay, if I fall asleep in the next 10 minutes, I'll get exactly 8 hours. 20 minutes pass. It's already 7 hours and 40 minutes. Matthew Walker said anything less than 8 is bad. Am I shortening my life? The pulse quickens. Cortisol drips into the blood. Am I too alert? Maybe turn on a breathing app. If I look at the phone, I'll destroy the melatonin. Don't look at the clock. Oh no. I looked at the clock. By the time you fall asleep, you have trained your brain that the bed is a place of performance evaluation, not rest. The next night, the body remembers. This is the place where we worry about how we sleep. Congratulations. You have built a self-reinforcing insomnia machine. The irony is that, when people with this clock insomnia are placed in a laboratory where it is quiet, dim, and there are no clocks, they often sleep more than they think. Their brains go through phase cycles in normal proportions. And if they are given long periods of darkness, as in Ware's 14-hour experiments, the old segmented pattern breaks through. Several hours of sleep, a period of quiet wakefulness, several more hours of sleep. In other words, left to its own devices, without alarms and the dictatorship of productivity, human sleep still wants to be more flexible and layered than our textbooks allow. This doesn't mean that insomnia is simply suppressed biphasic sleep. Chronic lack of sleep is serious, and medicine is appropriate here. It doesn't mean that sleeping pills are evil, but it does make one wonder. Part of what we diagnose as a disorder might be our ancient architecture, resisting an inflexible schedule. When this culture realizes that the rulebook is wrong, the rebellion begins not with hippies, but with high school students. Because if there is a place where the 24/7 world has been absolutely merciless, it is the teenage brain at 7:20 a.m. With the onset of puberty, the internal clock shifts. Melatonin begins to be produced later. In a 16-year-old, the release of melatonin occurs about an hour later than in a 10-year-old. Teenagers don't stay up late because TikTok is a sin. Their biology wants them to be awake at 11 p.m. and sleep until 7 o'clock or 8 a.m. In the 1990s, several school districts in Minneapolis did something radical. They moved the bell from 7:22. The result? Attendance rose. Students complained less about sleepiness and depression. A study of 9,000 students in several states confirmed, when classes start at 8:30 or later, grades and test scores become higher. There is less tardiness. Caffeine consumption drops. And the most unexpected thing, car accidents. In one Kentucky district, Moving the start of classes by just 1 hour led to a decrease in the accident rate among teenagers by about 16%, while in the rest of the state on the same roads, the accident rate was rising. In Virginia, teenagers in districts with early class starts were involved in accidents a third more often than in neighboring districts with a later start. As a result, in 2019, California passed a law prohibiting middle schools from starting classes before 8 o'clock and high schools before 8:30. The state effectively acknowledged the bell was wrong, the brain was right. Similar cracks are appearing in the adult world as well. In Iceland, the UK, Spain, and Germany, trials of a 4-day work week without a reduction in pay are taking place. Capitalism's metrics, revenue and productivity, have hardly changed, while human indicators have soared. Burnout has decreased, and the number of sick days has dropped. In the British trials, workers reported sleeping 3,060 minutes longer per night. If people are given an extra day to recover from social jet lag, their bodies do something rational. They repair themselves. Some companies are cancelling 8 a.m. meetings or introducing no meeting Wednesdays. Others include sleep in the employee handbook, subsidizing blackout curtains, or cognitive behavioral therapy. One Japanese company even offered bonuses to those who record a healthy sleep duration on trackers. A symbolic reversal. They used to pay for overtime, now they are experimenting with paying for time on the pillow. And finally, the strangest rebellion, the movement against alarm clocks. For most of history, they did not exist. Roosters don't count, they don't wind up for exactly 6:45. The mechanical alarm clock is a personal factory whistle that you voluntarily place next to your skull. For many, it has become so familiar that they cannot imagine a morning without it. But for a minority, it has become unbearable. These people are conducting an experiment. What happens if you let the body decide for itself when to wake up? They rearrange schedules, switch to remote work, or negotiate a late start to work. Some build their entire lives on a simple rule: no alarm clocks, unless you need to catch a rare flight. Is this a universal solution? No. Many types of jobs still require your presence when the clients arrive, not when your melatonin says you are ready. But the very existence of sleep freedom as an aspiration is something new. People who for centuries invented bells and whistles to force their bodies to obey the clock are now trying hesitantly, experimentally, to turn the clock back toward the body. Technology, as expected, is trying to both help and profit from this. On one hand, you have a growing arsenal of gadgets designed to protect ancient biology from modern light. Blue light filtering glasses that cut off the most melatonin-suppressing waves, from screen glow smartphone apps that tint displays amber at sunset, operating systems that now come with built-in night modes. On the other hand, there are smart bulbs and lamps that mimic the slow color shifts of twilight and dawn, bright and cool in the morning, warm and dim in the evening, recreating ancient cycles inside modern apartments. Then come the tracking devices, watches, rings, headbands that claim to read your heart rate variability, and micromovements to reconstruct sleep phases and recovery metrics. Many of them are primitive compared to laboratory polysomnography. They mistake wakefulness for light sleep or get the REM phase wrong. But on a cultural level, they do something subtle. They present sleep as something that can be optimized. Just as you track steps or calories, you can now track your sleep efficiency and readiness index. For the older generation, going to bed early was laziness. For the Netflix generation, with a $300 wearable device, it's a workout. There is something slightly dystopian about turning rest into a performance metric, but within this lies a genuine shift in values. For a long time, cultural heroes bragged about how little they slept. Thomas Edison called sleep a criminal waste of time. Margaret Thatcher allegedly got by on 4 hours a day. Hustle culture adopted the same script. I'll sleep when I'm dead. In the 21st century, the object of pride has begun to invert. Elite athletes talk about 9 hours of sleep as meticulously as they do about training miles. Tech CEOs write posts about their bedtime rituals and screen curfews. Popular science books proclaim sleep a superpower, the best legal productivity enhancer that you aren't using enough. Public health campaigns speak about sleep the way we used to talk about quitting smoking or physical exercise. It is a pillar of heart health, mental stability, and immune function. Even the office warrior, who has downed 5 cups of coffee, has at least heard that a sleepless night destroys memory and reasoning ability. In other words, a rebranding of sleep has occurred. It is no longer idleness, but infrastructure. And yet, despite all the apps, laws, and experiments, the victory of this revolution is still a long way off. School start time reforms exist, but in most of the world, teenagers still board buses before dawn. 4-day work weeks have passionate supporters and impressive pilot project results, but they are still rare enough to become news precisely because of their unusualness. Flexible schedules are concentrated in bubbles of intellectual labor. Nurses, warehouse workers, cleaners, and couriers still organize their entire lives around shifts, not chronotypes. Devices promising sleep optimization are expensive. The people most exhausted by shift work and multiple jobs, those who pay the highest price in health. For desynchronized sleep often find themselves the last and least able to join in sleep freedom. And behind all this, the same old economic engine continues to hum, quietly rewarding those who answer emails at midnight, say yes to a 6A call from an overseas office, or take the night shift because someone has to do it. The quiet revolution is real. It is written into California laws, into pilot programs in Iceland, into the night mode settings on your phone. But it is incomplete, uneven, and fragile. We are very slowly remembering that our brains and bodies are older than the factory whistle, that our sleep is not a defect that must be forced to fit the 24/7 world. The next step is more dangerous and interesting. It is what happens when you ask, if our biology resisted so strongly, what did our ancestors know about sleep that we have forgotten? Your ancestors did not have a bedtime. They had the night. And the night was not empty. It was structured, multi-layered, and surprisingly sensible. For most of the last 300,000 years, sleep was not that single, sacred, continuous 8-hour block you are told to chase. It was a fluid pattern shaped by the seasons, latitude, firelight, danger, hunger, and the needs of the group. Sometimes it was a long winter hibernation mode, more time in the dark, more time dozing by the fire as bodies conserved energy during food shortages. Sometimes it was fragmented by tropical heat with rest in the daytime shade, and more activity in the cool nights. Sometimes it was strictly limited by migrations, hunting, or war. Short snatches of sleep in turns while someone else watched for predators, raiders, or the fire. Your ancestors' nervous systems evolved within this chaos, and one of the clearest imprints of this old flexibility is what early modern Europeans took for granted, and you have likely never tried intentionally. First and second sleep, in diaries, court records, and medical texts from centuries ago, people casually mention their first sleep as if everyone understands what is meant. You go to bed a couple of hours after dark. You sleep for about 4 hours. Then you wake up intentionally, not in a panic, but just because for an hour or two. You talk quietly with your spouse. You pray. You throw wood on the fire. You go outside to check the animals or just look at the stars. Then, when sleepiness returns, you sink into second sleep until dawn. No one calls it insomnia. That's just how the night is arranged. When researchers in the 1990s placed people in a lab with long winter nights, 10, 12, 14 hours of darkness and no screens, something supernatural happened. After a few days, once they had caught up on sleep, their sleep began to divide. 2 main blocks of about 4 hours, separated by a quiet, reflective period of wakefulness in the middle. Blood tests showed that their hormones shift into a kind of quiet contemplative mode. During this nightly vigil, something between meditation and drowsiness. In other words, if you remove the alarm clocks and LEDs, many modern people naturally fall into the same segmented pattern found in old records. First sleep, the watch. Second sleep. Some historians argue about How universal this pattern was. Perhaps it mainly concerned Europeans in a certain climate and at a certain time. Fair enough. But looking at the written evidence and laboratory experiments, it is hard to ignore one thing. Your biology inherently contains more than one way to sleep. Circadian experiments in underground bunkers show the same theme. Remove clocks and social cues, and people do not become perfect 24-hour metronomes. Their internal day stretches slightly to 24.2 or 24.5 hours. They still anchor themselves roughly to one cycle of light and dark. But the exact timing of sleep and wakefulness is blurred, elastic, and adaptive. Now compare this to the world you live in. You were taught that a good sleeper is someone who lies down at 11, switches off like a Netflix app losing Wi-Fi, and jumps up at 7, refreshed and ready to create. The same number of hours every night, regardless of season, latitude, work, age, or genetics. Everything else waking up at 3 a.m., the need for a daytime nap, difficulty falling asleep at 10 p.m. is considered a problem. This definition does not come from your DNA. It comes from the factory. When mass industrialization hit, the priority was not your REM phases, but synchronization. Hundreds, thousands, millions of bodies had to show up at the same time, stand at the same machines, press the same buttons, board the same trains. The clock became the boss, and the movement for the 8-hour workday, for all its genuine victories. Finish the job. 8 hours for work, 8 for rest, 8 for what we will. Neat, symmetrical, and completely indifferent to the actual shape of human sleep. Artificial light, first candles and gas, then bulbs and screens did the rest. You no longer had to lie down shortly after dark. You could push your evening forward, filling the old time of the watch with newspapers, drawing rooms, factories, clubs, radio, television, and scrolling. The segmented nights found itself compressed. First and second sleep gradually merged into one block to make room for long evenings and early shifts. Waking up in the middle of the night turned from a normal, expected part of the night into a diagnosis insomnia. The quiet hour of reflection between two sleeps became something that needs to be treated with pills. The real reason you strive for 8 continuous hours is not because evolution sat down with a calculator and set a timer for exactly 480 minutes. Large population studies do indeed show a sweet spot. Adults who report 7 or 8 hours of sleep per night generally have lower risks of heart disease, stroke, and early death than those who sleep much less or much more. But these curves are averages. They don't care if your total is gathered in one piece or two. They can't tell if you are a natural owl forced to get up at 6 a.m. or a lark stuck in the world of night shifts. What turned 8 continuous hours into a moral imperative was something else. Labor politics, electric light, time zones, school bells, and the inertia of a culture that fell in love with the clock. Your ancestors did not count sleep in hours. They read it by the body and by the sky. So what does it mean to remember what they knew? It doesn't mean throwing your phone into a river and moving to a cave. It means quietly reclaiming the flexibility that is already built into your nervous system and discarding some of the shame that industrial time has wrapped around your pillow. It looks like this. If you wake up at 2:30 a.m. and feel strangely alert, you don't immediately fall into a panic that your life is ruined and tomorrow is destroyed. You acknowledge that for most of history, such a vigil was normal. You keep the lights dim. You don't blind yourself with blue screens. You read a few pages of something calm, keep a journal, or just lie there and let your thoughts wander. When drowsiness returns, you fall asleep again. You had a first sleep and a second sleep. Your brain has seen this pattern before. If your body starts sending you clear signals at 9:30 p.m. heavy eyelids, slow thoughts, you don't treat it as a weakness just because your friends can stay awake until 1 in the morning. You allow yourself to be a lark. If you are most alive at 11 p.m., you acknowledge that you are closer to an owl. You can't always change work or school, but you can stop pretending that internal midnight arrives for everyone at the same time. Chronobiologists have a word for what happens when the social clock and biological clock do not coincide. Social jet lag. More than half of people live with a difference of at least 1 hour, some with 2 or 3. Your ancestors had jet lag too, caused by seasons, storms, and migrations. The difference is that we now record this mismatch daily over many years. To remember what they knew is to ask yourself a tough question. Does your schedule respect your chronotype at all? Can you shift your work window an hour later? Can you group early meetings on certain days and give your biology a break on others? Can you build a small, legitimate siesta into your lunch? 20 minutes of real rest instead of caffeine and doom scrolling. And then comes the part we have almost entirely lost. The quiet middle of the night, intended not for productivity or entertainment, but for contemplation. Imagine that old vigil between the first and second sleep. No notifications, no deadlines, no result-oriented work. Just shared, dimly lit time when people whispered, prayed, made love, or sat alone with their thoughts. A built-in time for reflection, laid into the very architecture of the night. Industrial sleep crowded this out. Modern insomnia tries to bring it back, but it is saturated with anxiety and guilt. You probably won't be able to bring back a full medieval segmented sleep, but you can borrow the principle. You can intentionally create a small protected vigil, 10 minutes before bed in dim light, without screens, without any tasks. A ritual that says to your ancient nervous system, we remember that the night is not just a break between shifts. It is a space. We have lost the communal side of this as well. The shared night, entire villages whose rhythms curved synchronously around fire, and darkness families who knew by sound every creaky floorboard at midnight guards, whose job was to remain in a half-doze while others could fully immerse themselves in sleep. Now millions of us lie awake, thinking they are the only ones who fail at sleeping. But here is a twist your ancestors didn't have. They understood sleep from the inside. They knew it as an experience, a rhythm, a negotiation with weather, wolves, and hunger. They didn't know about REM phases, circadian periods, or the U-shaped mortality curve around 78 hours. They didn't know about social jet lag, melatonin, or chronotypes. You do. You are the first generation in history that can see both the deep past and the internal mechanisms simultaneously. You know that humans can adapt to sleep on ships, siestas in hot climates, segmented winter nights, midnight breastfeeding, and the age-related shifts of teenagers. You know that the 8-hour block is a historical compromise, not a sacred law. You know that sleeping 5 hours a night for decades in the name of productivity quietly destroys attention, mood, and health, and that excessive sleep can be a sign of illness, not virtue. For the first time, we have enough history to see how sleep was deformed by candles, clocks, and bosses, and enough science to see how far we can bend it back without breaking it. And that means that for the first time, sleep becomes something stranger choice, not in the sense that you can opt out of it, your biology will always collect its debt, one way or another, but in the sense that you don't have to accept the default form imposed by factory whistles and fluorescent lights. You can decide that your nights will be managed less by shame and schedules, and more by signals from a body that remembers ice ages and oil lamps. You can treat the 8-hour rule not as a commandment, but as one of the options in a much older and broader repertoire. The question is not how to force yourself to sleep like an ideal factory worker. The question is different. Now that I understand this story, the evolution, the past, the clocks, the catastrophes, and everything else, how do I want to sleep? Because the next chapter of this story will not be written by alarm clock companies or shift schedulers. It will be written in your bedroom, night after night. And here is the quiet climax that the factor is never planned. When you see a story in sleep rather than a sentence, something elusive happens. Your night stops being a pass, fail test and begins to look more like those ancient patterns we traced. Imperfect, adaptive, and full of choice. Modern sleep science confirms this more strongly than you might think. Health agencies are now talking about sleep behavior rather than sleep fate. They recommend at least 7 hours for most adults, not because everyone is stamped from the same mold, but because among millions of people, it is at this mark that the risks of heart disease, stroke, and early death are generally at their lowest. This is not exactly 8 hours carved in stone. It is a range, a goal that can be approached from different sides, and experiments continue to confirm that even small shifts matter. In one recent study, people added less than 1 extra hour of sleep per night, about 46 minutes. This isn't some monastic transformation. It means turning off one more episode or putting the phone away a bit earlier. But the effects were measurable. More resilience, more gratitude, more willingness to help others. People became a little kinder, thanks to slightly longer nights. In other words, you don't have to rebuild your whole life to rewrite the story of your sleep. Small edits matter. This might manifest as protecting a regular bedtime more fiercely than night scrolling, or giving yourself 15 minutes of dim, quiet lull instead of falling into bed straight from bright screens, or experimenting with what actually calms your brain. Reading, breathing exercises, a short gratitude list, because we have real evidence that directing thoughts in this way can make falling asleep easier, and improve how you feel upon waking. None of this will be perfect. Some nights will still be interrupted by work, children, anxiety, or pain. In some periods of life, 7 hours straight will seem like science fiction. That's okay. Human sleep has always been chaotic, but now you know that, inside this chaos, there is room for choice that tips your biology in your favor, instead of always fighting it. So, wherever you are right now, in a night shift break, in bed in the dark, dozing on a train, or awake at 3 a.m., wondering what is wrong with you, possess a different story than you did an hour ago. You know that waking up in the middle of the night does not automatically mean you are broken. It might just mean your nervous system is remembering an old pattern, the vigil between the first and second sleep. You know that the 8-hour block is a historical compromise, not a law of nature. You know that enough sleep is a range you can explore, not a single magic number you have failed to reach. And because of this, your next night, to a small but real degree, depends on you. If this has changed your view of sleep even a little, let me know. It helps more than you can imagine. A like under this video. Hitting the subscribe button. This is the quiet fuel that allows me to keep digging up the hidden stories behind everyday life. I will be glad to hear from you in the comments. Tell me where you are listening from, what time it is there now, and if you have ever had that strange nightly awakening, and if, now that you have learned about the first and second sleep, it feels a little different. Share your own experiments. Naps, siestas, early bedtimes, late chronotypes trying to survive in a morning world. The more perspectives we gather, the clearer this picture of human sleep will become. If you want to take another step and support the channel directly, there is an option to sign up for membership on the page. Sponsors allow me to spend weeks studying research, old diaries, and strange footnotes so that I can turn them into episodes like this. But it is completely optional. Truly, every view, every comment, every time you let one of these videos run in the background while you fall asleep, that is already a colossal help. Whichever way you choose to support or just quietly observe from a dark corner of the internet, I am grateful that you spent this part of the night here, because now, when you turn off the light, you carry within you a different understanding of what that act means. You are not trying to obey a factory rule. You are participating in a living, flexible, 300,000-year-long dialogue between the brain, the body, and the darkness. So tonight, when you close your eyes, remember, you are not just falling asleep, you are joining a ritual that is 300,000 years old. Sleep soundly, sleep wisely,